was that there has been some significant improvement in the corporate governance environment in banks. And that was ascribed to the mandatory code that had come out and the efforts of the central bank. Never mind that that was not to turn out to be entirely correct, but that were some of the key things that were influencing us. And so we said what we needed was some shift away from the total laissez-faire environment to one of some kind of compulsion, so to say, or mandatory requirements in the Code of Corporate Governance. And I think we tried to achieve that, even if not very effectively. Now, the other issue that perhaps weighed in our minds had to do with the reach of the code itself. Now, we were very ambitious, given some of the context in which I spoke about earlier, and we wanted the code to extend beyond the scope of the Securities and Exchange Commission. We wanted a code that would to some extent apply to all sorts of companies, not just listed companies with listed securities, but companies that we defined as having large stakeholders. Many of the telecom companies, for instance, many of the other companies that impact very heavily on the Nigerian economy, and including consumers and members of the public, were outside the purview of the capital market regulations. So we felt that there was nothing wrong with the SEC initiating something in that direction. Well, obviously, as you saw from the final outcome, SEC has retraced that a little bit. It has narrowed itself to its main core mandate, which is regulation of the capital market. But these models exist in other countries. In South Africa, in other places, attempts are made to encourage companies that are not necessarily listed, but that have substantial stakeholders to comply with this code, especially as if some of them would go into this capital market eventually. So that was to encourage the development of the culture of good corporate governance. Well, I think very wisely, the Securities and Exchange Commission kind of backtracked on that. Well, we're happy to live with what is finally the agreement, and I think that they must be right on that. Finally, I would just like to say that there are many issues which the committee grappled with, which perhaps may not be too obvious in the code, but some of which perhaps it's still good to bear in mind as we discuss it. One was the convergence of the regulatory environment. We needed a situation in which there was some kind of convergence of various, as you know, there's so many codes that are operating in the market. You have the CBN code, we have the insurance code, and so on and so forth. And we felt that the Securities and Exchange Commission needed to provide some form of convergence. Now, in the present finally approved code, there is a very curious provision which says that where standards have been set by this particular code or other codes that apply, then the ones with stricter provisions will prevail. Now, of course, that remains to be seen what will amount to stricter provisions. I hope that will be picked up and discussed. Now, there are so many other interesting innovations in the code, which I don't want to go into them because my other colleagues will touch on them. But I do hope that as we look at this code, we'll adopt the spirit that Christopher Kolade mentioned, which is we approach it positively. It is not meant to stifle innovation or meant to stifle flexibility in the governance of our corporations. It is meant to provide basic minimum standards. And it is hoped that indeed corporations will aim at higher corporate standards, because this is the only way that these efforts will make sense, and it's the only way that the Nigerian economy can really move forward. We don't see this as the maximum standards. We see it as the minimum standards and aim to achieve even higher standards. And I do hope that in the coming years, further reviews will push it a little bit further forward, so that we can really, perhaps in the not too distant future, say that we have arrived where we should be, both in terms of the standard of corporate governance, but also in the wider sense of where economy is in Africa and the world at large. So I thank you very much for this, and I hope that these deliberations will continue to strengthen our code. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Abubakar Mahmood, and I think one thing we're taking from you, your contribution is that a code of corporate governance is a moving train. It doesn't have a bus stop, so you just have to keep adding and changing as you move from one bus stop to the other. So it's a continuous exercise, and this exercise, of course, will continue. For our viewers, for those who are watching this event live on channels television around the world, on satellite television, it's also available to viewers, those who are using iPod, iPad, and iDroid, and this is a live transmission, and it continues for the next 1 hour. Now we need to move on very quickly, and we have 4 more members of the panel who will make just about 5 minutes each first interventions that we need to hear from our audience. These are distinguished captains of industry, these are market operators, and there are CEOs of securities exchanges who are also seated here, so we need to hear the perspectives. We need to hear from Mrs. Benedicta Moloko, who was a member of the board of the NDIC, Nigeria Deposit Insurance Corporation, and a past chairman of the Institute of Directors. Now, this is something for you directors to enforce. And earlier we hear that executive directors should not be allowed to fix the executive compensation. And that's coming from Dr. I beg your pardon, Dr. Christopher Kolade, who was a former chairman of Cadbury Nigeria PLC. We'd like to hear from you, Moloko.
The code has been copiously reviewed, and its essence stressed by both Dr. Kolade in his keynote address and the reviewer of the code, who is the legal advisor of the corporation. I just want to highlight 2 areas. First of all, the responsibility for compliance has been put squarely at the foot of the directors of the companies. And you know that there are just about 600 listed companies in Nigeria out of the 800,000 plus that are registered in this country. If each of them had maybe 4 or 5 directors, we're talking about maybe 3,000 people who have this huge responsibility of ensuring that this very important document permeates their organizations. And I think the basic thing is that the directors must first of all read and understand the code. We had a situation where we had a code before, and I can tell you from interactions with different directors that just a small percentage of them had actually taken the trouble to read the code, much less implement it in their organizations. In fact, many of them didn't hear of a copy until 4 or 5 years later. I think this has to change. We have seen from the crisis in the financial sector a couple of years ago that there is huge responsibility lying on the heads of directors because of their fiduciary duty to the companies that they run. It is therefore in their best interests, in order not to get entangled with regulators, to devise ways and means of being familiar with the code and ensuring that their companies imbibe the contents. I'm really happy that the code as presented today is very clear and easily understood, and is supposed to foster confidence and bring us to the same level as some of the other capital markets in the rest of the world. It is a voluntary code. We re-emphasize that. However, it requires great commitment for it to be implemented because the provisions are quite diverse. In implementing the code, you must not forget that the primary responsibility of companies actually is also to comply with the core set of regulations and laws in the country. There's the Company and Allied Matters Act, and there are various legislation applying to different sectors of the economy. In banking, you have the Banks and Other Financial Institutions Act. In insurance, you have the Insurance Act. You have the Investment and Securities Act, just to name a few. Part of corporate governance is actually ensuring that you comply with the letter of the laws that govern your sector. Defective risk management and internal control policies and other standards will actually jeopardize stakeholders and other interests. So the provisions of the code actually highlight and specify and draw your attention to specifics that you need to pay attention to. This code actually is supposed to move the public companies to a more disciplined and formal way of conducting their business. So it raises professional standards and encourages higher standards of service delivery, because if you are compliant, then your operations should necessarily improve. But I believe that in order for directors to sell this code down to their organizations, they need to convince them, actually, that there is a benefit for them. Over the years, I know that different studies have been carried out. There's the 2003 McKinsey report, which attempted to establish a link between good corporate governance and business success and growth. While it tried very hard to show certain examples, of course, you have the premium on the share pricing, you have growth in reputation capital, and so on. It is easier for you to see that where companies are not complying with corporate governance, the imminence of failure is actually pronounced. And examples abound in our own backyard. The commitment to higher standards of ethical behavior and practices has to be established. We also, I think part of the things that I just want to stress is that directors face the challenges of keeping their companies in business, profitably so, and we all know that sometimes the cost of implementing corporate governance can be high. You need to recruit different categories of people, maybe even a compliance officer that you never thought about. You must have several committees to look at different aspects of the company's operations, the internal audit function, and all that. It is true that it could be expensive, but that is if you're short term. If you think long term and think of what those processes can do for your organization in the long run, then you would have you will be inspired actually to implement the code. We also look at the value addition by directors. Directors sometimes do not look at the value they bring to the table in terms of other stakeholders. This is the time where if you are protecting stakeholders' interests, you have to look at it as a premium that you're adding to your company's operations. I believe that the commitment of directors to implementing this code has to be clear. And I believe that maybe the Securities and Exchange Commission should have a system where companies can sign on to and agree to implement the code in their organizations, not just the reporting requirements that are demanded in their annual reports, but a public affirmation that, yes, we understand the code and we're going to implement it. So this will help directors. The board itself must also be qualified. I know there are copious provisions there for training, induction, and all this, but many times in boards, it is the director that has to more like pull himself up by the